Okay, welcome to this, the second in a series of panel discussions on the future of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. This evening, we will continue our discussion relating to the question, what does the future of Cyprus look like? Before I introduce the panel, I would like to recap on where we are. During the last debate, we covered a lot of ground and touched on some of the historic reasons why the Cyprus issue has not been resolved. I would encourage the panelists to approach the debate with an open mind. As we look forward to the talks that will be held either in Geneva or New York, we have noticed that a number of the parties in the talks have already tried to float the arguments that they will deploy. And we thought it would be interesting this evening to get the view of the panelists on a couple of them. Our panelists this evening are Alper Ali Riza. Alper has acted in a large number of reported cases since the 1980s. Alper is a regular columnist on the Cyprus Mail and is fluent in Greek and Turkish. Oğuzhan Hasipoğlu is a TRNC member of Parliament and part of the TRNC Presidency Negotiating Team Legal Counsel. He's a member of the Istanbul and Gurne Bar Association's Legal Counsel, Cyprus negotiations since 2004. Cypriot Duncan Smith is the Member of Parliament for Chingford and Woodford Green. Cypriot was the former leader of the Conservative Party, leader of the opposition, and MP for Chingford and Woodford, home to one of the UK's largest Turkish constituencies, and has been an MP continuously since the 9th of April, 1992. Sir Geoffrey Donaldson is the Member of Parliament for Lagan Valley in Northern Ireland. He's leader of the Democratic Unionist Party in the UK Parliament and chair of the APPG on Turkey. He was first elected as an Ulster Unionist Party candidate, and he is best known for his opposition to the UUP leader David Trimble during the Northern Ireland peace process. He is Northern Ireland's longest serving current MP. Since December 2019, he has been the leader of the DUP in the House of Commons. Dr. Christian Heinze is assistant to the President of the Constitutional Court of Cyprus in 1962-1963. He was witness to and observer of the Greek contraventions against the Cyprus treaties of 1959-60 and their aftermath. Historically significant witness to the contravention of requirements laid down by the 1960 treaties, the guarantee and establishment. He's a doctor of law and a member of the German Ministry of the Economy between 1958 and 66. He's a practicing barrister and solicitor since 1966 in administrative law of the economy and public services, including constitutional law. He's a writer on legal and political matters, and his temporary duty, he said, is 1961 German Embassy to the Organization of the Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, at Paris. So if I can begin with my first question, and I think I will put Alper on notice on this one to kick off. The first question is, it is widely believed that the UK are putting forward a 7-point plan ahead of the 5+1 talks later this spring. And for those of you who don't know, the 5+1, that includes the Turkish Cypriots, Greek Cypriots, Turkey, Greece, the UK, and the UN. I would like to start by asking the panel, a phrase that's been used is a community sovereign state. Alper, what do you understand a community sovereign state to be, and what does it mean to you?
I think what I understand and what it means to me is the same. What it means is that when Cyprus was established, It was established as a two-community state. That didn't work. I think what the British have in mind, if, and it's a big if, there is truth in the news reports, what they have in mind is now that there is a Turkish Cypriot area exclusively inhabited by Turkish Cypriots, then what they have in mind is a two-state community-based federation, I think. And I'm not sure about whether the word sovereign is in the original, because I think that the British would not use it for the simple reason that it would put off the Greeks completely. But if they did use it, then I apprehend what they have in mind is that the Turkish Cypriot federated state, as it would become, would have a certain power to deal independently of the central government. In particular, I think that it would have the facility of being able to conduct dealings with the European Union, much the same way as Scotland used to, much the same way as states, the land in Germany do, and I think much the same way as the Belgian communities and states are able to conduct a relationship with the European Union. So insofar as the word sovereign has been used, and it's a big if, I apprehend that what they have in mind is this ability of the states to deal with independently of their central government. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I'm sure Oğuzhan would maybe have a comment on that.
Well, thank you for this meeting, for this panel, because the subject is important for us. What is the future for Cyprus? So I would like to thank all the participants and the organizers for discussing this subject, because we have been discussing federation since 50 years, let's say, and the 1960 Republic. We should bear in mind that Turkish Cypriots were the co-founders of this republic. So Turkish Cypriots were the equal partners of this republic. So that is why Turkish Cypriots was, and it is still, a sovereign and has the right to ask for sovereignty. Unfortunately, as you know, this republic lasted 3 years. And after 1963, Greek Cypriots were enjoying this republic, enjoying this sovereignty. But we should bear in mind that it's a fact that Turkish Cypriots never lived under the Greek Cypriots autonomy, under the Greek Cypriot administration. After this period, Turkish Cypriots had always formed its own state, and the last state, as you know, is 1983, Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. We have our own land, we have our own population, we have our own legal system, which is working properly. And that is why if we are going to demand, if we are asking sovereignty now, it is from the Turkish Cypriots inherent right, let's say. It's a right which has arisen before 1960. And at the Cyprus Republic, it was confirmed. But unfortunately, because of Greek Cypriots' excessive demands and to ask to cancel the veto right of Turkish Cypriots, then this equality, political equality, became an issue. And then afterwards, as you know, the problems at the island had started. I don't want to go into the detail of the history, but just I would like to emphasize that sovereignty is not a problematic issue, is not something which should be granted to Turkish Cypriots now. It's Turkish Cypriots do have a sovereign rights, and that's why now what we are asking is a sovereignty and equal, to be an equal partner, and to be able to ask self-determination. And what we are introducing now to the discussion table is sovereign equality. So when we come to the related questions, I'm going to go into the detail of this sovereign equality concept.
Okay. Do any of the other panelists wish to comment on this idea of community sovereign state before I go on to the next question, which is around the UK 7-point plan? Sorry, Jeffrey, you need to put your speaker on.
Yes, thank you, Brooks. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
And thank you for this opportunity. I've been to Northern and Southern Cyprus many times. I've met people from both sides and looked at the peace process in Cyprus, the negotiations. And my answer to the first question, I think, is I'm not going to answer the question of what I think a community sovereign state is, because I think if the UK government is planning to present a potential solution, it's starting from the wrong place. The previous initiatives in Cyprus have failed precisely because everybody wants to talk about what the end result looks like without designing a process that can actually help them to get to their objective. And as I have studied the Cypriot negotiations in the past, and I compare them to Northern Ireland or South Africa or Colombia, where I've been involved in all of those situations, I think the process is deeply flawed. Every time we have an initiative, it is a high wire act. It revolves around the two presidencies. They're put in the spotlight. They have a small negotiating team. You have the international community. And Brooks, it is not conducive towards a kind of accommodation, developing the kind of accommodation that is required. And people are, this was a mistake in Northern Ireland. For years, the British government's approach was, here's a solution, have an assembly, here's a political institution that will solve your problem. Whereas in the negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement, we designed a process which was about talking about the relationships between people and how people can live together on an island in peace. And then when you've established the principles upon which you have the basis of that peace, you then design the political institutions to go with it. Unfortunately, this approach is the other way around. You design the solutions and then hope that people will somehow be corralled into them and find a way of living peacefully together. And it simply doesn't work. You're starting from the wrong end if you take that approach.
Yeah, no, I think really what you're saying is if we're to develop a strategy, let's work from the bottom up rather than the top down.
Absolutely.
Dictating what people on their desktops think the end result should be. A better approach either is, I guess you're saying, a bottom up, working with both communities from the bottom up. And I guess a second solution or process to solution is sort of second track diplomacy and getting the ground set before you have the megaphone politics that tend to follow these sort of things.
Yes, and Brooks, if I might just add this, in my studies of the Cypriot peace process, it is an exclusive rather than an inclusive process. Civil society is not really involved, except for some informal consultation. Many of the political interests are not really involved because it revolves around the presidencies It revolves around the people at the top. And we found in Northern Ireland, when you do that, it doesn't work. You need an inclusive process, a process that includes some formal role for civil society, as well as ensuring that the political interests are represented across the board, and not just whoever happens to be in power at the time.
Yes, of course, the situation in Northern Ireland is not comparable because Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. The position of Britain and Cyprus is that they're two independent states, and Britain happens to be a guarantor power. And as a guarantor power, it has certain obligations, and it's going to participate in talks called by the UN Secretary General quite soon. And it's perfectly right and proper for the United Kingdom to put forward, with the experience of the Foreign Office going back many years, putting ideas on paper for discussion. I can see absolutely nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I think, sorry, not to interrupt you, Alper, and we're going to move on to Christian in a minute, because we're going to talk about this 7-point process. I think what Sir Geoffrey point that he was making is one about process. He's not simply saying the UK shouldn't have a 7-point plan, or that the superpowers shouldn't have an idea of what they want. He's saying that if we want to achieve the goals that we want to achieve, another approach to problem solving is working from the bottom up.
No, I understand that.
That's what he's saying.
Yeah, I understand that absolutely.
Not creating a direct simile between Northern Ireland and the UK and the north and south of the island of Cyprus.
Although Brooks, I would simply make this point to Alper with respect. Ireland is an island that is divided. Cyprus is an island that is divided. You have two communities that look to greater entities. In Northern Ireland, you have the Unionists who look to the United Kingdom, and you have the Nationalists who look to the Republic of Ireland. In Cyprus, you have a divided island. You have the Greek Cypriots who look to Greece, the Turkish Cypriots who look to Turkey. So I don't think there are not some parallels, but the conflicts are unique. The solutions will be unique. And what I'm talking about is not the solution, it's the process that gets you to the unique solution that will work for Cyprus.
Okay, before I move to the next question, I think Sir Iain would like to quickly say something. And my next question will be to Dr. Heinze. So Sir Iain, did you have?
Yeah, my experience of these things is that everybody thinks they're unique. And everybody wants to start from the uniqueness of their position. And that means, therefore, that no matter what the lessons are elsewhere, they cannot be applied to that particular problem. I think Geoffrey's right in this, that the uniqueness isn't so unique. The reality is that it seems to me that one of the biggest problems that Cyprus faces is the same problem that South Africa faced, and the same problem that, in a way, that Northern Ireland faced. And I say that as having served there myself some years back. It is that what happens when people set up their plans is that means almost immediately one side or the other is going to have to be seen to have compromised or stepped back. That immediately makes it almost impossible for them to agree anything, because that shows weakness. The point that's really being made, and I don't need to stress it any more than this, is that sometimes sorting out the problems at the lowest level first about the relationships, for example, issues around people who have claims on territory, that were there prior to the war, issues around how people from the UK can visit relatives if they happen to be in North Cyprus or whatever. These sort of things may appeal like small things, but they are confidence building measures that eventually start to allow people to come to the table agreeing that maybe there's not quite so much that divides them progressively, and build up towards some kind of agreement. And I think that's really what Geoffrey is saying, and I rather support him in that, because everywhere that's been applied, by and large, to my experience, and particularly the ones I just talked about, you do tend to make greater progress towards getting some kind of solution. The same, actually, funny enough, in the one settlement they had in Israel, which that they went through. So.
Yeah, no, we'll get to the confidence building measures a bit later, Iain, where I've got you as a question there. As part of the 7-point plan, the UK has floated the idea of a Belgian system for selecting ministers as a model with a parliament of 36 MPs, 24 Greeks, and 12 Turkish. Should one side have the veto? Alper, would you like to comment on?
Well, I'd like to comment like this.
Yeah.
As in other forums where decision-making has to take place, the practice, I think the modern practice is, on certain important decisions, you need unanimity. So I don't know, you call it a veto, but in the European Union, for example, you need unanimity to admit a new member, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But the general practice, as I understand it of late, is to have consensus. In other words, to strive to compromise so that in the end, everybody supports a decision with different degrees of emphasis. And I think that this way, which is the European Union way, I know that Iain is not a great fan of the European Union, but in some of its decision-making, in particular, the idea of unanimity on important decision-making and consensus going down the scale is a way that is a way forward in Cyprus also, without getting stuck on loaded words like veto and so on. It's best to sort of avoid that because it has a bit of a history in Cyprus. But unanimity and consensus, yes, depending on the importance of the decision.
Oğuzhan, do you have some thoughts on this idea of a Belgian system?
Well, first of all, there is no 7-point plan. I mean, to officially, let's say, presented to us. First, I have to say this, but specifically to the question, of course, as you know, in 1960 model, Turkish Cypriot side, each side actually, not just the Turkish Cypriot side, each side did have a veto right. So veto right at that time was a sign of political equality. So in any kind of model, federation, confederation, two states, whatever you call it, at the end of the day, veto right should exist. That is my opinion.
Okay, if I can stick with you, Oğuzhan, as the talks continue, would it be an idea if the Republic of Cyprus suspended its active membership of the EU and the UN in the hope that this would create an even playing field and focus minds? Quite a radical question, but I'm wondering, what do you think about that?
Well, if one side is at the comfort zone and enjoying the status quo, then you cannot reach a long-lasting solution. If the two sides, Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots, they may be equal at the negotiation table, there may be of this principle of equal footing, which is an UN concept. But if one side is, when Greek Cypriot leave the negotiation table and their leader is called president and our leader is called community leader, then there is a problem. And to be honest, I participated to the negotiation process since 2004, and between 2010 and 15, we have discussed everything with respect to a federation model. Each side know its red lines very well. We know the problems very well. I can tell you honestly that the real problem is that Greek Cypriot side still not ready to share the wealth around the island and to share the governance of the island with the Turkish Cypriots. Federation is a concept which is based on sharing, but unfortunately, Greek Cypriots still have difficulty in sharing this existing, let's say, sovereignty, existing rights. For instance, still at the Greek Cypriot side, at their parliament, the seats which are reserved for, in brackets, Turkish Cypriot parliamentarians are empty. For instance, at Brussels, 6 seats are still occupied by Greek Cypriots, which normally 2 seats should have reserved for Turkish Cypriot MPs. Every month we visit Brussels, European Parliament, but we don't have a right to vote, or we don't have a right to speak. So what we are now saying, that when we sit at the negotiation table, at least our status, our sovereign equality should be acknowledged by the Greek Cypriot side, because otherwise, which is a very right question you have raised, they will continue to enjoy this comfort zone, and they will never be willing to share the governance of this island with us. That's the problem, and we believe that we have exhausted this federation negotiations. That's why we need to introduce this new concept. But when I say new concept, it's an already existing concept. It's written at the UN Charter. But now I think we believe that it is our right to demand this sovereign equality, because we have discussed everything in detail. We have exhausted this process, and that's why to this new 5+1 UN meeting, which is going to be held at the end of April, United Nations will give this chance to us, and Greek Cypriot side will be ready to listen us. So the United Kingdom, Turkey, and Greece as well, we shall have the chance to present our new arguments.
Okay, so rumor has it that Dr. Heinze can speak. Can you? Is your system working, Dr. Heinze? Would you like just to comment on some of the discussion so far?
Well, would I be allowed for just a moment to return to your first question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think this was a very, very good idea to put this question at the beginning of your schedule, because it gives us an opportunity to produce clarity about what we are talking about. And the first point I would like to make in this connection is that if there is no state, there is no sovereignty. So if there is to be a state in Cyprus, someone must be sovereign. Then the question is how is sovereignty distributed in a federation? Now, if you take the notion of federation in its original narrow sense, a federation requires at least 2 sovereign states, and they remain sovereign during the federation, because if one loses sovereignty, there is no federation anymore in this narrow sense. Of course, it cannot be overlooked that the notion of federation has been used widely in a different sense. Like there are some states that call themselves a federation, like Germany or Austria. But if you look at it more closely, you find that they're not a federation. There may have been a federation at one point of history, but they have developed to become a state with one and only one sovereignty. Now, this may be disputed, but I think it's a very valid idea to stick to the original meaning of state. So still, there remains a certain justification for these states to call themselves a federation, because even if they are not a federation, they can still be organized like a federation would be organized, at least in part. The German Länder have parliaments, they have governments, but they're not sovereign. If they were sovereign, they would be able to break away from the Federal Republic, which they are not. So if you like to apply this notion of a federation, which is not actually a federation, how this so-called federation is going to be organized. The details of the organization make all the difference. And there are so many different types, all depends on the organization of such a federation. So nothing has been said so far about that. But that is then the crucial point. And in the case of Cyprus, of course, it means how is the self-determination and security of the Turks to be guaranteed, and how are decisions to be brought about that should really be in the interest of both parties. Now, as the last point is the question of this addition of a community, which actually certainly refers to the historical fact that Mr. Riza mentioned, that there were originally two communities in Cyprus that formed the Constitution of 1960. These communities, of course, still exist. But the question is, which is their political status? Now, as sovereignty is concerned, it should be kept in mind that this notion sometimes misleadingly is used to describe a right or a claim for something that isn't there, but that is considered that it should be there. The right, if you're right, it's your claim. But an useful notion of sovereignty goes far beyond that. It should be essentially based on the fact of permanently established superior power over a defined territory with its inhabitants, which is then legitimized by a basic order granted by those in whom this power is vested.
Okay, Heinze, I think that's been a very interesting, albeit somewhat philosophical discussion on what federalism is and federation and so on. But I'd
like to come in on that just very briefly.
Okay, briefly, Alper, because then I want to go back to Surya and Duncan Smith on a question.
2 points. The first is that sovereignty is an eminent concept. I think international lawyers are not in full agreement about what it means, but generally it means, as I understand it, the state of being a nation state, a country, able to engage in international relations. I think that's what sovereignty means in a nutshell. But there are various arguments. Second point, on the question of federation, I don't agree with Dr. Heinze. The United States is the classic
of
a federation. Yeah. And the United States had embryo, the first 13 states were embryo colonies that then became independent and then joined together for generally to defend themselves against Britain, by the way. I think that was the idea. So the concept that somehow you've got to have sovereign states and then unite is a view that obviously Dr. Heinze is entitled to, but I don't think it's the generally accepted view.
Yeah, no, I think your analogy of the US is an interesting one, because the states have a lot of individual power, but collectively, with certain key decisions, those decisions are made centrally.
A federal, yeah, of course.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
the FBI, for example, is a federal bureau.
Yeah, as is,
It doesn't mean they don't have local police force.
but the local police forces are very independent. But,
Oh, yeah.
but Iain, I just want to actually go to you, because time is ticking on, and there's notwithstanding Oğuzhan's sort of somewhat constructive approach to things, there's been what I would view perhaps as not a constructive move by the Republic of Cyprus government, which unilaterally announced this week that any non-EU citizens in future will not be allowed to cross the border from the south of the island to the north of the island. What does this mean for British Turkish Cypriots and expats who wish to return home to visit their family and friends? And should the UK have direct commercial flights from the UK to the north of the island?
Very good. Can I just, I'm going to answer that question, but I just want to step back to Alper's point. It's very dangerous to use the United States in this example for one very good reason. The real definition of whether you are sovereign or not is your ability to secede from whatever else of the other power. So, for example, if you look at the US Civil War, yes, it was about slavery, but the real argument was, on the basis of slavery, did the southern states have the right to secede from the Union? And the war was about whether they had that right. The war won by the North meant they had not the right to secede, and that is the established position thereafter for the United States. They are federal, but with powers on the states, which are very extensive, as Brooke said. But bear in mind that single one point: do they have the right to secede? The UK has seceded from the EU. Why? Because we have the sovereign right to do so, which meant that we were always sovereign inside the EU. My point therefore is, when we look at these things, we've got to be very careful. That single factor is the critical defining point about whether you are sovereign or not sovereign. It's whether you can leave the institution that you were part of or not. Let me come back to the other question by Brooks. I do think that any action like this at this stage is a retrograde step. If you are about to start a discussion about whether you can get a settlement, and goodness gracious, we all want there to be some kind of settlement in Cyprus that allows people to get on with their lives. We tend to forget sometimes as politicians, as we strut around the place making great statements about where we think things should be. Actually, ordinary people trying to get on with their lives are the worst affected by all of this. And I can think of the families in my constituency and elsewhere across London who desperately want to be able to visit their families in northern Cyprus. And pretty much every obstacle is in their way at the moment. And this is the point I agree with Jeffrey about, is try and settle some of these issues at the bottom end to get confidence before you start trying to pontificate too much about what the eventual settlement would be. So this border dispute that now is in place, by the way, there have been many occasions when the border has been shut, or at least it's been incredibly difficult for people to get across if they fly into the Republic of Cyprus and then try and get into northern Cyprus. Sometimes it can be very, very difficult for them. It depends what the mood is at the time. But the main point I'd make is I would stop this at once, because it is not going to help. If you're making life much more difficult for people in northern Cyprus, it's going to make it much more difficult for people to reach any kind of agreement, because there will be no trust. And I come back to the point that if you want to get an agreement, and goodness gracious, we should want to do that after all these years, you have to start with some beginnings of trust and the building of confidence. And shutting a border like that does not exactly help build confidence. And it does mean that many people are going to struggle now to see their families, particularly as we come out of COVID. There is going to be a serious demand to want to, travel and go and see families, quite legitimately. And the other area is one of vaccines. You know, what are we going to do about trying to help both sides in Cyprus get proper flow of vaccines? I know the UK would want to help enormously. So this sort of process, I would urge the government to think again about shutting the border, just on the pretext of it being about EU or not EU. It is an absurdity, really, because the border is locked against the British citizens as they travel. So why should it be the case that this border would now be shut? It's a retrograde step and should stop.
Well, actually, on that, your sort of penultimate point there, I mean, given there are about, I think about 10,000 British citizens living in the north, do you think the UK, this is a good Prime Minister's question for you, Iain, do you think the UK government should send the COVID vaccine directly to them?
Well, I'm in favor of supporting British citizens wherever they are. And I want to make sure, frankly, you know, if we're talking about trying to help the whole world and sell and send our surplus vaccines to other countries in the world, some of which, by the way, we may not have any historic connection with. We have a phenomenal historic connection with Cyprus. I'd be very happy to help Cyprus, north and south for that matter, to get the vaccines they need. And British citizens who are over there, I would certainly want them absolutely to be able to get the vaccine. The truth is, the only way out of COVID, which is a terrible killer, is to get vaccinated, and therefore we should do our level best to get them to them. And again, I would urge politicians in Cyprus to recognize that for all the established disputes, problems, and obstacles, saving lives should be their #1 priority.
Thank you for that. Oğuzhan, before I move to Sir Geoffrey in a minute, but you know, what do you think of the latest move by the Republic of Cyprus government to unilaterally effectively shut the border like that? It's not exactly confidence building.
Well, in order to build something, there has to be a confidence. So still we have a confidence problem. First, we should have a confidence, then you can build on it. Unfortunately, I'm not surprised with this, but obviously I'm expecting a help, a support from British government, not to listen Greek Cypriot side, because as you have just stated, there are more than 10,000 British citizens who own properties, who have lives at the northern part of the island, and more than 300,000 Turkish Cypriots living in United Kingdom. So it's unacceptable. It's against human rights. I mean, we have not been officially informed yet about this. We have already approached to British embassy here, to the United Nations as well. They tried to do this to the Russian and Israeli citizens a couple of years ago. And we have approached to Russian embassy and the Israel embassy, to the Israeli government, and they have reacted against Greek Cypriot government, and this had been rectified at that time. So we are expecting the same approach from British government. They have a border as well here, as you know, British bases. So at least the people who came from England to Cyprus, South Cyprus, they should be able to pass from the British sovereign base border area. And this situation should be come to an end, because Greek Cypriot government cannot do anything to the European Union citizens, because this issue has been regulated under Green Line regulation. But for non-EU citizens, and now Greek Cypriot side is trying to make use of this silence of the related regulations, and trying to create embargo to the Turkish Cypriot economy. This doesn't help. This kind of approaches doesn't help to the solution negotiations. On one hand, we are going to discuss how we can cooperate, how we can come together with our counterparts. On the other hand, they are going to impose any kind of embargoes on us. They are going to create embargoes on sports and cultural events to the Turkish Cypriots. They are going to impose restrictions to the traveling of the people. These are all actions against human rights. And what we are expecting from UK is not to listen Greek Cypriots this time, because this time they are not in the European Union. So I'm sure they will have the flexibility and they will have the positive approach to the Turkish Cypriot people.
Okay, Dr. Heinze, before I move on to Sir Geoffrey, is there anything you'd like to comment on sort of the latest move by the government, Cyprus government?
On the latest move, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, frankly speaking, I am less and less occupied with these doubtlessly important questions about individual little things that can be done about life in Cyprus. Of course, I will not deny they are important for the lives of the people there, but once they become of a bit of a larger political importance, they will always be barred by the Greek side, because the Greek side will not give up any of their advantages that the support of the family of nations for their claim for sovereignty over the whole island gives them. And this consideration has brought me to the opinion that a real permanent peaceful settlement of the Cyprus problem can only be achieved in connection with a settlement of the greater conflict over the whole Eastern Mediterranean Sea. Because as long as the Greek side will insist on their sovereignty over the island, we have a point with which Turkey cannot live. It implies a special economic zone calculated from the existence of a sovereign state of Cyprus under Greek majority rule. And the result is that if you follow this EEZ concept, almost the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean Sea is controlled by Greece and its allies. And this is an absolutely situation that can never lead to permanent peace. You have a people of 10 million in Greece with a long coastline, of course, but you have a 10 times larger people opposite the Mediterranean Sea in Turkey with the same long coastline. And so the control over this Eastern Mediterranean must be divided in an equitable way, taking into account these political, geological, economic, military facts, political facts in the region. So the result of this, to put it shortly, of this way of thinking is that if you want to improve the situation of the Turks at Cyprus, you have to do everything in your power to find a settlement for the Eastern Mediterranean conflict.
Okay, that's a very helpful, giving us a good understanding of certainly the geopolitics of what's going on. But I'd sort of like to throw Sir Geoffrey a slightly softer question, because confidence building is about empathy, sympathy, and so on. And I guess my question is: a successful federation requires mutual empathy and sympathy between the populations involved, mutual need and assurance that one population will not dominate the other. Do these prerequisites exist between the two communities on the island of Cyprus? Which I think we know the answer, but I'd just be interested in your opinion.
I think the will is there amongst many people on both parts of the island. I think they want to live in that kind of relationship, but it certainly doesn't exist at the moment. And I agree entirely with Iain that instead of looking for ways to be obstructive, I think people need to begin thinking about ways to build confidence and trust, because it doesn't matter how many parties are at the table. If the trust is not there and people on either side lack confidence in the other, then it is very difficult to achieve a successful outcome. And when you look at all of the field initiatives that have taken place over the years, it is my view, Brooks, that the key missing ingredient every time has been the lack of engagement with people, the lack of inclusivity of the process, the lack of consultation with the wider communities, the lack of engagement of civil society, and it being a political high-wire act. That does not build confidence. It does not establish trust. And they are essential, absolutely essential to getting the kind of agreement. The difficulty is people tend to focus on what does the outcome look like? What is the shape of the new dispensation, the new constitutional arrangements, the new political institutions? But unless you have trust and confidence, even you were to design and agree the new institutions, they will not work properly and effectively without the trust and confidence. Because in the end, a conflict is about people. A conflict is about how people feel about each other and towards each other. Where there is mistrust, where there is suspicion, very often goes with it negative results, negative consequences, even sometimes violence. Where there is confidence, where there is trust, then that is, I think, a necessary prerequisite. And Iain is right. If I were sitting down now to design a process for Cyprus, I would begin immediately to look at what are the immediate confidence building measures that could be taken in advance of people sitting down at the table to create an atmosphere within which there is the possibility of people building a relationship with each other or renewing relationships. And I don't see that happening. I see the opposite happening. I see people taking up position. I see the trenches being dug, if you like, that is not conducive, Brooks, towards the kind of successful process that's needed. So I agree with Iain. We need a confidence building process in parallel with a negotiation process to build trust and confidence. And at the same time, as a key principle of the process, it needs to be more inclusive. And you can actually make it more inclusive by drawing people into the confidence building track as well as into the negotiating track.
Just a quick contribution.
Hold on, one at a time. Alper, I'm going to come to you in a minute because I'm going to ask you the next question. So let me go to Oğuzhan.
Just a quick, I mean, I fully agree with Mr. Donaldson and Mr. Smith. with respect to their explanations regarding confidence building measures. I just want to make the recent UN reports. In every 6 months, UN issues reports with respect to Cyprus, good offices. And there is an interesting determinations in the last reports. And what UN observed, that why Greek Cypriot side is reluctant to cooperate with Turkish Cypriots, is reluctant to develop confidence and to create confidence building measures, is the fear of the recognition of TRNC. And this had been written in the last 2 reports of UN, and Greek Cypriots unfortunately couldn't get rid of this fear, and that's a problem. They have to overcome this problem.
Okay, thank you for that. You can answer that question in a minute, Alper, but I want to ask you, because we've got over 60 questions from our audience, I sort of want to bring in the audience a bit with some of the questions they've got. So I'm going to ask a question for you from an audience member, but you can also come back and answer this last question, okay?
Sure.
So the question from Ilker is, if the Greek Cypriots continue to say no to a deal for the next 200 years, does that mean the Cyprus problem will or should remain unsolved? When will it become reasonable for the Turkish Cypriots to say enough is enough? Alper.
Well, I mean, the hypothesis that they would say no for 200 years is, of course, one I'm not prepared to engage. I mean, obviously. But I think behind the question is how long really should the Turkish Cypriots be prepared to try and come to a deal before they say, well, it's not going to happen, we'll go our own way. I think that's what's behind the question.
Yeah.
And the answer is that there is absolutely no reason why they shouldn't try for a federation again this time. And the reason why I say that is because I think that the Greek Cypriots are under a lot of pressure from the European Union, which they treasure. The Greek Cypriots value their membership of the European Union a lot more than the British did. They are very proud members of the European Union, and they take an active part in all its deliberations. So the answer to the question is that this time round, with the kind of pressure that there is to reach a federal settlement, I emphasize the word federal because the European Union is not going to accept 2 states. Can you imagine? 2 extra member states, Cypriot states. It just can't happen. If the Turkish Cypriots want to go the 2-state way, then they're going to have to go away from the European Union. That's fact. So the answer to Ilker is, yes, I understand the frustrations that arose as a result of the debacle at Crans-Montana in 2017. I understand that perfectly. Anastasiadis, I think, was messing them around, messing the Turkish Cypriots around because he thought he wouldn't get elected in the Republic. So, but everybody in Cyprus with any sense on the Greek side, as I read it, thinks that he ought to have done a deal in 2017. And at this time, the pressure is on. He seems to be talking about a loose federation, whatever that means. No one really knows. For my part, I'm quite happy if there is a federal solution. The detail of it will depend on both sides' views about how much power they want to share, how much they want to be governed by the other side, and so on. But the principle of a federation, in my opinion, is extremely important. I should say on the question of federation that it was a Turkish Cypriot idea. It goes back, I think even, well, I said Turkish Cypriot, I should say it was Bülent Ecevit's idea before the war in 1974. And the Turkish Cypriots established a Turkish federated state immediately after the war in 1974 for 8 years. And then they forgot about the TRNC and wanted a federal solution and voted for one in 2004. They agreed another federal principle in 2014, I think Mr. Eroglu did. And when they voted for Mustafa Akinci in 2015, they voted for a federal solution. So it looks as though this idea of two states was at the instigation and on the suggestion of who? It looks as though it was President Anastasiadis to get out of his difficulties in 2017. And to be honest with you, as a barrister, I never adopt the argument of the other side. If the other side, if my opponent puts forward an argument, I don't adopt it. And I would urge the Turkish Cypriots not to adopt an idea that came essentially from Mr. Anastasiadis.
Okay, so we've got 60 more questions to get through here quickly.
Yeah, the 3 points.
I'm curious, Oğuzhan, what do you think about what Alper has just said?
Well, now we have new leader, Mr. Tatar, and he sends his regards to all the participants. And our new leader has been elected by stating and emphasizing two-state solution.
Mm-hmm.
And that was why Turkish Cypriot people elected Mr. Tatar. And we have introduced this sovereign equality concept. So there is going to be a 5+1 meeting, and at that meeting, UN will seek to see whether there is a common ground, whether there is a common vision with respect to our new ideas. UN also had stated that this time should be different. So if you continue to do the same thing, do the same proposal, you are going to meet with the same failure, unfortunately. So federation, okay, it may be a good model for other countries, but for Cyprus, unfortunately, I'm saying this, unfortunately, Greek Cypriot side is not ready for this. Maybe in the future, but we have to sit at the negotiation table, and when we get out from the negotiation table, there has to be a two sovereign state. We have to be equal now.
Okay, so equal partners. Dr. Heinze, you're keen to get in now.
Yes, I suppose that this federation, which is advocated by Mr. Riza, is supposed to be a sovereign state. And if it is, will it not claim an exclusive economic zone in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea? And if it would, it can never expect Turkish assent. It is an illusion. It's utopic.
Okay, yes, this is the big dispute over resources just offshore, I think is what Dr. Heinze is referring to there. But since we do have also a British sort of Turkish Cypriot audience listening, I got a question from Keenan, perhaps to Sir Iain. Can the UK open up the British bases for humanitarian flights to and from the UK so that families can visit their families in the TRNC if effectively the government down south continues to ban crossings to the north?
Of course, why not?
Well, I suppose
we can't have commercial, right?
Yeah.
We can't land commercially. So can we use British bases? in order to facilitate things?
I don't think we would be able to use those bases for those sort of flights, because they are military bases there, and that's what part of the agreement was originally they were stayed for. But having said that, I'm sure if there was humanitarian aid in some particular requirement, whether it be, for example, vaccinations or other vaccines, then there may be an argument for that. But I think in terms of people visiting their families, I think that would be, I cannot think of any reason and how the British government would be able to do that. And I also don't think the British government would want to do that, because that would put the British government right in the middle of this particular argument. And frankly, as a guarantor, their problem is going to be standing back from it rather than being in the middle or even beginning to take sides on it. From my own personal standpoint, I think the truth is right now, as quick as we possibly can, we have got to try and get both sides to recognize the key bit here is that ordinary people, ordinary families living in the UK and families in Cyprus, both the Republic of and Northern Cyprus, should have an absolute right to be able to visit their families one way or the other. I just can't understand why they would be used as pawns in this process, and they shouldn't. So my biggest focus has always been on the fact that I've wanted people to be able to visit their families, because I think that's a humanitarian area. I accept that, but let's need to get that settled. So we come back to the original question you asked me earlier on, which is, I think that it would be a very good thing if the border was opened and people could find their way across the border, should they have to fly into the Republic of Cyprus, to get to Northern Cyprus to see their families. I know also they could fly in to Northern Cyprus, but the problem there is they're not allowed to fly direct, so that makes it even more complicated. So these are the sort of things that would build confidence if they could settle those things early on and not use them as tools in the debate.
Yeah, but before I get there, there's actually a big question. I asked for short questions. I got a very long question around the Constitution here, which I may well involve sort of Alper and Oğuzhan, certainly in. But I want to go back to Sir Geoffrey. What sort of 2 or 3 confidence building measures, with respect to the UK, sort of ask for as an easy ask to try and maybe build confidence that isn't seen as a threat, in essence, particularly to the South, in order to, for example, I'll just give you an example. Our last session, there was a discussion around having British business people go over and engage more with businesses in the North. What other sort of confidence building measures that you've seen take place in Northern Ireland could be replicated here in Cyprus?
Well, Brooks, I echo what Iain has said, to the extent that the best confidence building measures are ones that are about people, and especially people to people contact, because that really is about building trust. If I was designing a program in Cyprus to help with this process, I remember visiting, there's a wonderful facility right on the Green Line at Nicosia, where they've done some wonderful dialogue and peace building work in that facility. It's mainly run by women. And I think the more, first of all, the more you can do to encourage people to people contact, the more people become friends, the more they learn to trust each other. And I know that there's been a bit of that in Cyprus, but if there's a move back towards restricting movement, and I accept in COVID pandemic circumstances, you have to look at restricting movement, obviously, but beyond that, people-to-people contact is very important. And I think a civic dialogue alongside a negotiating process could be very helpful. Travel is another area where I think, and I echo what Iain said, look, I understand where Cyprus, where the Southern Cypriot government is coming from, but you know, preventing people to traveling directly to visit their families, it's an irritant. It is not conducive to building trust. It creates resentment, which has the opposite effect. And I think then looking at the economic situation, Brooks, if people feel better off, they are more inclined to take a positive view towards a solution, a political solution. They're more likely to feel less threatened. So I think that we need to look at what can we do, and the EU puts a lot of money into Cyprus, southern Cyprus, and Turkey, of course, puts money into northern Cyprus. But could the UK government look at developing programs which would be designed to encourage economic cooperation across the island between the north and the south? That is certainly something that has worked on the island of Ireland. We now have, for example, an all-island electricity market. Now, I'm sitting in my home, I've got lights switched on. Does it matter to me whether the power that powers this computer or those lights is generated in Dublin or Belfast? Of course not. It just matters that when I flick a switch, I've got a light. So there are areas for practical cooperation, Brooks, that I think would go a long way towards building that confidence and not threaten the political or undermine or in any way compromise the political positions of either side.
Thank you for that. That's a very constructive suggestion, certainly there. But I do want to ask more of a difficult question that I'm going to ask Alper, Oğuzhan, and perhaps Dr. Heinze to respond to, which is over the issue about the Constitution. And a lot of questions are around this question. So there's one broad question that's been thrown at me here, which is the validity of the Cyprus Constitution is often called into question. It is used to argue against any kind of partition or annexation of any part of the island, regardless of the violent conflicts that have taken place. However, it's also clear the Constitution isn't upheld regarding the essential presence of Turkish Cypriots when it comes to running of the Republic of Cyprus government. So the question is the Constitution of Cyprus still valid or not? And if it is, does this make the Greek Cypriot run government a caretaker government only? And I'll start maybe with Alper. Do you want to have a go?
Yes, sure. The Constitution of Cyprus is perfectly valid. It was established, the Republic of Cyprus was established through treaty agreements between Cyprus, Britain, as the colonial power, Greece and Turkey. These agreements and the treaties are registered with the United Nations. And consequently, there is no doubt that the Constitution is valid. It's still valid. The Greek Cypriot case is that constitutional necessity has meant that the Turkish Cypriots cannot participate in the government. But the Republic of Cyprus government is recognized internationally. There is a distinction which a lot of people don't understand, and I'm bound to say that I had difficulty in understanding it myself, but now I think I've come to grips with it. And it is this, that basically there are two laws that govern states. One is its own constitutional law, which is an internal matter. And the second is the position of a particular state internationally. The Republic of Cyprus is recognized internationally. It's a member of the UN, it's a member of the EU, it's recognized by all the countries in the world bar Turkey. And so the answer to the question is the Constitution is valid, it's still valid. It can, in my opinion, be reactivated once the Turkish Cypriots are back in the fold. And indeed, it brings me to my point, and that is that a federation is not ruled out completely by the Constitution of Cyprus. If the parliament were to vote 2/3 majority to have a federation, now that the Turkish Cypriots are concentrated in one area, that's perfectly possible. However, what is impossible and what is unlawful and what the Treaty of Guarantee guarantees is a union with another country is excluded, with another state is excluded, and separatist independence or two states is also excluded. It is unlawful for Turkey to promote it, and it would be unlawful both under the Treaty of Guarantee and also the Constitution.
Okay, we got lots of questions coming in. I got 77 more on my list, so I suspect we may well spill over beyond 8:30, which I said I would not do. But Dr. Heinze, before I get to Oğuzhan to respond to what Alper has said, do you have any comments on the constitutional issue as posed by that question?
This discussion of the Constitution underlies a similar mistake as a discussion of sovereignty. A constitution is not just a piece of paper which contains regulation in the shape of a law. It is not even a law because there is no one to guarantee it. The Constitution becomes valid only if it is sufficiently backed by the actual political factual situation. It must be carried by the will and the engagement of a unified people. So as a result, I have very early made a point of arguing that there was never a valid constitution of Cyprus of 1960, because at the moment that it was signed, Archbishop Macarius declared that he would not obey it in as far as it restricts his goal of achieving Greek sovereignty over Cyprus. So even if you looking at the Constitution as sort of a contract, this contract wasn't valid for the same reason. You cannot sign a contract and say, I don't want it. And of course, even if this view was wrong, then the Constitution has certainly come to an end, not only with the violence employed in 1963, where the government of Cyprus decided not to protect.
Okay, so I'm going to have to turn to Oğuzhan, perhaps to respond to Alper at least.
1960 Republic was a bicommunal republic, which was giving political equality and sovereignty to each community. But in 1963, as you know, Turkish Cypriots were kicked out from the republic because of the Greek Cypriots attempts. And in my opinion, constitution was breached at that time by the Greek Cypriots. And after that period, Turkish Cypriots had never been under the authority or sovereignty of the Greek Cypriot side. So, the Greek Cypriot side membership to European Union is another breach of the constitution, because there is an explicit clause in the constitution and also in the founding agreements that Cyprus Republic cannot be a member to any association, to any union without the consent, without participation of the other guarantor countries, which in European Union, Greece is a member, but Turkey is not a member. So Turkey consent was never taken. So that's, for example, another breach of the constitution.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we've got to wrap up in 6 minutes here. So I'm going to ask quite a broadish question here that goes back to the 59-60 founding agreements, but also it's an opportunity for each of the 5 of you to sort of wrap up as well. So the question is, the founding agreements of 59 and 1960 created a republic that more or less functioned as a federal state. This was scuppered by the Greek Cypriots with the Akritas plan and termed a stepping stone by Makarios, referred to the union of Cyprus with Greece. With 11 plans put forward for solving the Cyprus problem now since 1964, all of which have been rejected by the Greek Cypriots. Haven't we been down this road already? And is it not time for a person says here, a factory reset to solve this problem once and for all? So I'm going to go to, I think I'm going to go to Alper first. Alper. And if you can, 2 minutes, you each get 2 minutes here.
Oh,
Okay.
2 minutes, fine. Okay, right. The first point I'd like to make is that the federation has never been tried in Cyprus. What was tried was power sharing based on communities that were interspersed throughout the island. What has never been tried, and what I urge people to really, really consider, is now that the Turkish Cypriots are in northern Cyprus, with adjustments at the border between them, we have the makings of a federation which has not been excluded by the founding agreements. What the founding agreements say, what the constitution says, is that the territory of Cyprus is indivisible, but that is not a basic provision of the constitution. It is a provision that can be changed by a 2/3 majority of the House of Representatives voting separately. Mm-hmm. And therefore, my view is that it would be very easy to keep the 1960 constitution and the treaties with a few changes, and then move to a federal solution which can satisfy all the concerns of all the parties. And on top of that, in my opinion, it's a legal opinion, it would be lawful. It's no good trying things that may be unlawful, or trying things that the European Union will never accept, or other countries will never accept. What we've got to do is make sure, as I said in an article recently, A, that whatever we do is lawful in international law and in constitutional law. 2, that it is feasible, because you need the agreement of the Greek Cypriots to have 2 states. And 3, that it's desirable. Is it what people want? Do the Turkish Cypriots really want to lose membership of the European Union that Turkey has been trying to get in for about 70 years now?
But no more. But
sorry?
No, but they no more want to. But yes,
No, they don't want to, but they've been trying for 70 years.
Yeah, no.
And we're being told to get out.
You've had more than your 2 minutes, but thank you for that.
I've finished.
But that was a tour de force, as always. Okay, Oğuzhan, I'm going to go to you to take on Alper a little bit on what he's just said.
Yes, I have to say that I am disagree with what Mr. Riza says, because what we had been discussing half a century, let's say, was federation. I mean, it's purely. And even Turkish Cypriot people in 2004 has approved another federation plan, which was Annan plan. and it was rejected by the Greek Cypriot side, as all of you know. And unfortunately, following this result, at that time, Kofi Annan issued a report, and in his report, he had stated that Greek Cypriot side is not ready to share the governance of the island and to share the wealth around the island with Turkish Cypriots. And since 17 years passed following the Annan plan, this idea, this approach of Greek Cypriot side is not changed. I mean, they are still not ready to share. So that's why it is not necessary to discuss the federation model anymore. It's not because of the Turkish Cypriot side. Turkish Cypriot side has never made a mistake, but unfortunately, still the Turkish Cypriot people are the one who are being penalized by the European Union and by the international community. This is not fair. So what we are saying now, we have exhausted this federation process. 5 years ago, 3 years ago, I could say the same things what Mr. Riza has just said. But now we have the right to ask to negotiate two-state solution now, because I was in Crans Montana, and before that I was in New York, Geneva, everywhere I had been as a negotiation team member. And in the end, when it comes to a stage that we are about to reach a solution, Greek Cypriot had always escaped to reach a deal with the Turkish Cypriots. And that was why we have to get rid of the signals of the status quo. I mean, the unlimited federation negotiations is a signal of the status quo. Embargoes, isolations is a signal of the status quo. Closure of Varosha, it's a town in Famagusta where I came from. Unfortunately, it had stayed closed. Can you believe a town which one day Greek Cypriot side will reach a solution with us under federation model, and we are going to give this town back to the Greek Cypriot side. Why do I have to wait anymore?
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. So I think I'm going to go to actually I'm going to go to Iain before I go to Jeffrey, because Jeffrey's sort of been one of the great problem solvers in dealing in Northern Ireland. So 11 deals later, no plan accepted. Is it time for a factory reset? And what does that factory reset look like? Iain.
Well, I mean, in a sense, that's the question. It's been nothing but constant factory resets, only it never gets off the ground. I think the biggest I mean, I'm not going to get in the middle of an argument about two states or the federation, because I think that's something clearly that has to be thrashed out between the different parties. I mean, I think the problem is the way you arrive at it. That's really where I was. I think that if the politicians in Cyprus, Northern and the Republic, can actually just agree that they need to resolve issues that stop people kind of trusting each other, I think that's an important feature. My personal view is centered solely around the needs and wants of what I think are the legitimate needs and wants of those who want to see their families, visit their families, who work hard, who have added hugely to the UK economy and want to be also able to visit their families in Cyprus. I want the UK to play a part in trying to establish that confidence building process, even before we get to the top line idea of what the final solution will be to the problem here. The only way of getting this sorted is first and foremost that people on both sides begin to start that process of building trust. I remember spending time in South Africa at the time, looking at things like the peace and reconciliation process that took place there. And these were laughed at the beginning. But in fact, on both sides, when we took evidence there, we went down as a committee, and we found actually the effect on people on the ground, not the politicians so much, it was people on the ground that found that they could find a way to accept that it was time to change their attitude to each other. And that was a really important process. It may seem a little bit soft, but it's not soft, because it ultimately results in an acceptance of a solution that is then agreed at a higher level. And if you try and shove it down from the top, all that will happen is people's trust is not there, like they did last time when they were asked to vote on it in referendum. The Republic of Cyprus, the people in there rejected it in a last major deal in the referendum. So my point is, somehow you've got to break that down and find ways to just bit by bit bring the communities more together to recognize who they are. During the election, I had a conversation on the doorstep with a Greek Cypriot who was furious and angry about what was going on, and started the process by saying, people in North Cyprus have no rights, they're not really Cypriots. He wanted to go and take himself all the way back to hundreds of years ago and argue whether or not they'd have arrived there. And I remember saying to him, but all this is meaningless at the end of the day, because unless you agree that you start from where you are, not where you would wish to be or where you might have been 400 or 500 years ago, that's the first thing. We are where we are. Now we have to start building bridges and start changing it. And I want, as I said before, those people from Cyprus who work, live, and are British nationals to be able to get home and see their families, whichever side of the border they lie. And the most difficulty lies in North Cyprus, because they simply can't do it. And I think it's high time we started just there.
We've got two knights of the realm here, and I'm sure they're both going to be in violent agreement with each other. But I'm sure, Sir Geoffrey, you're going to, again, focus, I suspect, on a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. So over to you. Final words. Can't you?
You're muted.
You're muted. You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Brooks. I assure you, Iain and I have not signed up to some nightly code that means we can't joust with each other. But we do agree on this. And if a factory reset is needed, it's not in what the solution looks like. It is actually the very process itself. And I echo everything Iain has said about what is needed next. And I think some time should be taken to look at the design of the process and the role that confidence building can play in that process, and the role that a more inclusive approach can play in that process. My experience, when we were beginning our negotiations in Northern Ireland, we spent some time in South Africa. Now, South Africa and Northern Ireland are a world apart. The problems were different, the nature of the conflict was different, but what needed to change was the mindset of the people. I learned a lot from the South Africans. One of the things I learned from Nelson Mandela was a very simple phrase he used. You do not make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. And to do that, you've got to be able to build trust with them. You've got to be able to establish some degree of confidence. And unfortunately, that is absent, I think, at times in the approach that's taken, not because there isn't a desire. When I visit Cyprus, whether it's the north or the south, when I talk to ordinary people, there is a desire for peace, for a mutual coexistence, to be able to live alongside each other as good neighbours and friends. But the difficulty, Brooks, is this: when you create a process that is effectively like a stage, when people are on a stage, they feel the need to perform. And in performing, they are looking over their shoulder, wondering what their own people are thinking, and they are hesitant. There is a lack of trust. So I think that rather than once again go for the high wire act, put politicians on a stage where they have to perform, I think we need to start from the bottom up, look at a confidence building process, and look at how you can make the process more inclusive, and at the same time build the capacity of the leaders to reach agreement. The two go hand in hand.
Okay, and if Dr. Heinze, if you can, are you able to speak? If so, can you give a 60-second summary of your views?
Yes, well, I must repeat myself because the final solution, the final settlement depends on an agreement about the economic zones in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. If that is settled, the Turks and Greeks of Cyprus will easily find a way how to live together.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, well, it's been a really excellent debate. We still have at least 87 questions from the audience, so there's been great audience participation. Oh, we haven't been able to answer all your questions, which is regrettable, but you will get a second opportunity on the 24th of March. But before I get to that, I would like to thank all of the panelists, Alper, Oğuzhan, Iain, Jeffrey, and Dr. Heinze for your participation. And I'd like to thank the sort of sponsors, the CTCA, BTCA, and the Circle Foundation. Have a good evening.